Greetings, adventurers. This is Cause of the Warforged here, and today I have an Arcane Archer build that is going to be incredibly fun to play and very well-rounded, able to deal with any type of threat, whether that be a group of enemies or a singular target. This build has it all. It's got damage, it's got crowd control, it's got AoE, and it even has some added survivability. We're going 11 levels of Arcane Archer Fighter and 1 single level of War Domain Cleric. Now you might be thinking, of course we're going War Cleric for that extra attack, but really it's more so that we have access to some very useful cleric spells such as Shield of Faith and Sanctuary that are going to give us the much needed survivability to round out the build and to make sure our character is not only deadly, but also very difficult to deal with for the enemies. But let's get straight into the level progression. We are going to be playing a fighter. And of course, that's because the Arcane Archer is a fighter subclass added by patch 8. We're going to be picking the archery fighting style because we're going to be using ranged weapons for the majority of the run. Now, when it comes to our ability point lineup, we are going to be prioritizing dexterity because we're going to be using bows and longbows and even hand crossbows if you want. Now, the end game, we are going to be using the dead shot, as you can see here, which is going to be a longbow. So ultimately, yes, we are going with dexterity. But as a secondary stat, what you're actually going to need for this character as well that you might not normally do on a fighter is intelligence. So let's go ahead and just change these up around. We're going to be prioritizing dexterity as well as intelligence for this character. Now, if you're going to go for the Hag's Hair, then I recommend dumping some strength or dumping some wisdom and bumping your dexterity up to 17 and then getting the Hag's Hair to bring that up to 18 so that when you take the ASI, you're already going to be at 20 dexterity by the time you're level 4 or 5. That's going to be very powerful. We're going to go with this setup because we do have the Hag's Hair for dexterity on this character. All right. Now, as we level up, we are going to be getting Action Surge at 2nd level, a nice big boost. I forgot to mention this, but for our race, this is just the character's race that I chose initially. It's going to be a Wood Elf here. That's going to give us 5 feet of extra movement from fleet of foot, extra mobility to position around. The race really doesn't matter for this build whatsoever for the Arcane Archer. If I had to say, if you wanted resistances, then, playing a Dragonborn or playing a Tiefling would be good. But yeah, in terms of a ranged character, you're not going to get that much more benefit out of anything else. Really, the bonus movement speed out of playing a Wood Elf means you're going to be able to kite off melee, especially in the early game, so I actually think that is going to be the most beneficial. But coincidentally, I think Wood Elf is a great race to play. All right, and as we level up to 3rd level, we get access to the Arcane Archer subclass. This is going to give us access to some really awesome arcane shots that are going to modify our attacks, very similar to Battle Master Fighter. But first, we also get a cantrip, which is really useful. So we can take the Guidance cantrip. That is the most goated cantrip. You can add a plus 1d4 to any ability check you're making. You got to do persuasion checks, intimidation checks. If you got to do athletics checks or any sort of other check, guidance is going to be helping you a lot. So if you have a cleric in the party, that's fine. But the Arcane Archer by themselves is going to be able to have that guidance, which is actually very handy outside of combat. All right, so let's go over the arcane shot types. There is a total of 8 different arcane shots. Each one has a different effect. And all of them are very interesting and pretty unique too in terms of having these options for ranged characters. So the first one we have is the Banishing Arrow. Now this is going to banish your opponent on a failed charisma saving throw for 2 turns. That is incredibly powerful. Banishment means they are out of the fight temporarily. They cannot interact with the battlefield and you cannot interact with them. Now, because this is a charisma save, majority of the time, even before you get your Helmet of Arcane Acuity, and we're going to talk about that later, even before you get your big boost to DC in your saving throws, most enemies have bad charisma saves. And so targeting their charisma saves with Banishing Arrow very easily means most of the time you're going to be able to remove threats off the battlefield. You can banish an enemy that you don't want to deal with at the moment, kill its allies, and then when it comes back, hopefully you've dealt with enough of the surrounding enemies that you can then change your focus to this one. So Banishing Arrow is a must-have. Even in the early game, I highly suggest you take Banishing Arrow. For the love of God, take it. Next up, we are going to have Beguiling Arrow. So this is going to deal an additional 2d6 psychic damage, and the target is going to have to make a wisdom save, which if they fail, they will become charmed. This is also incredibly powerful because the charmed condition prevents enemies from targeting you aggressively. They could still cast darkness over your face to blind you, but they can't directly attack you with a firebolt, a chill touch, or a ranged attack, or even a melee attack. This is particularly debilitating to melee characters because oftentimes they don't have anything to do other than smack you in the face. But when you charm a target, they're forced to attack somebody else. But, you know, in the case where you are playing solo or you're the only target on the battlefield, they straight up will just skip their turns if they are charmed. So this is a very powerful effect. Wisdom saves, some enemies do have pretty good wisdom saves, but oftentimes, and especially with the Arcane Acuity hat, enemies are going to fail their wisdom saves. So this is a very valuable shot type. Early on, would I recommend it? It's really up to you, but this is a very valuable attack. And next up we have is the Bursting Arrow. This is going to deal a burst in a 3-meter area of effect that does 2d6 force damage to all the enemies. And then of course the enemy that you target is going to take the full damage as well. Now, the Bursting Arrow is going to be very powerful early on, especially at level 3. If you want, you can go ahead and take that and you're going to have a good AoE option. But later on, you might want to respec and get rid of the Bursting Arrow. It does not scale well into the late game. Unfortunately, the AoE burst is not going to be proccing or getting additional damage from the rest of your build. So it's just simply not going to deal that much damage. It's just a little bit of chip damage when it comes to the late game. But early on, that 2d6 force damage is huge. It is tremendous. It is very valuable. So really, it's up to you if you want to take the Bursting Arrow. Early on, I highly recommend it. And later on, I recommend respecing out of it. Now, the fourth one we have is Enfeebling Arrow. This is going to deal 2d6 necrotic damage, and the target must pass a Constitution saving throw or become enfeebled, meaning that they deal half damage on their attacks. That is very powerful. It's quite debilitating, but it is a Constitution saving throw, which, as you already know, enemies usually have good con saves, though more often than not, this is not going to work. Necrotic damage is often heavily resisted as well, so this simply is not going to be a very viable option for most of the game. There are niche scenarios where it's very powerful, but I would rather have the ability to charm a foe or to blind a foe or to banish a foe than to feeble them. Making them deal half damage is great, it is good, but I'd rather have them just miss from blind or from not being on the battlefield whatsoever, or not even being able to attack me because they're charmed. The other effects are just a little bit more higher value to the point where I cannot justify Enfeebling Arrow. Now next up is Arcane Shot. Grasping Arrow. This is pretty much the classic that everyone would always run in D&D 5e. It is still pretty powerful. It's going to deal an additional 2d6 poison damage. The creature is going to be slowed by 10 feet, and they will take slashing damage when they move on their turns. Now, this is a strength save to pass, so a lot of enemies are going to be pretty good at passing against Grasping Arrow, but you can target, backline, especially range backline, who's going to be moving around, trying to shoot you from afar, and this can be a very powerful option. However, because it is a strength save, I really don't recommend taking this one, especially, it's decent in the early game. The damage is actually very, very potent in the early game. If you want to take it in the early game, and especially against like goblins and things like that, if you want to target those enemies that might have bad strength, this is going to be pretty good. But later on, again, your other shot types are just going to be doing so much more work because they're CCing the enemies, actively preventing them from dealing damage, or making them take more damage in some cases, whereas the Grasping Arrow is only going to slow them down just a little bit. Next up is the Seeking Arrow. This is going to deal an additional 1d6 force damage, and on a failed dex save, fairy fire your enemies, making subsequent shots much easier against them. This is a really cool shot type. This can go around corners, this can curve the bullet, kind of like magic missile, and for that I recommend trying it out because it's just downright cool and very fun. However, again, late game, it pales in comparison to your other options, especially options that are going to be affecting targets and making their lives harder to attack you. And that brings us to one of my favorite ones, which is going to be the Shadow Arrow. This is going to deal 2d6 psychic damage, and on a failed wisdom save, it will blind your target. A lot of the times, it is a constitution saving throw to blind your targets, such as with the blindness and deafness spell. Having that on a wisdom save is really, really good, especially early on when people have bad wisdom saves. So Shadow Arrow is incredibly useful. It's better than Fairy Fire on a target because if you hit them and they're blinded, your attacks will have advantage, but their attacks are going to have disadvantage on you. And this is specifically really strong against spellcasters who depend on line of sight. They need to see their targets to use their spells. If you blind them, you are crippling them so that they have to come up to your face in order to do anything effectively. And as an archer, you're going to be staying back, so you're not going to be anywhere near these motherfuckers. Shadow Arrow is really, really powerful, and I cannot recommend it more. Now, our last and final arrow shot is going to be Piercing Arrow. This is going to allow you to fire off a burst of damage in a straight line. Now, each target has to pass a dex saving throw, or they will take a chunk of damage. And the really good thing about this is that Sharpshooter applies to this. Your on-hit effects are going to apply to this, and it actually does keep up with the late game. If you are getting surrounded by hordes of enemies that have anywhere between, 45 to 60 HP, Piercing Shot, if you let out 2 or 3 piercing shots, you will be clearing the battlefield. The AoE for this is quite good. 10 meters is very long, and the width of the attack is also very wide as well. So this is a very good AoE option that stays relevant even to the late game, whereas the Bursting Arrow unfortunately kind of falls off. So, if I had to pick 3 that I was going to be sticking with for quite a while, it's going to be Banishing, Piercing, and Shadow Arrow. Those are my favorite 3. Of course, you do get access to more arrow types later on, so don't fret too hard if you're struggling to pick between 3 in the beginning. Just pick out whichever ones you think seem interesting, which sound fun, and again, based upon my experience, these 3 you're going to get the best mileage out of. There's almost never a bad situation for you to use at least one of these 3. Oh, so that was a lot to cover, but let's go over to fighter level number 4. This is going to be where we get our feat, and of course we're going to take an ASI. We're going to go straight for Dex because with the Hag's Hair, this is going to be 20 already. Level 5, easy peasy extra attack. Level 6, we get another feat, and at this point, if you have the Hag's Hair and have 20 Dex, then there is for sure nothing better to take than Sharpshooter. Sharpshooter is going to be incredibly high value for you here. So we are going to go with Sharpshooter. That is going to be giving us the ability to basically make power attacks, where we take a -5 penalty to the attack roll and we deal an additional 10 damage. Now, this applies to all of your magic arrows, including the Piercing Arrow, and that's going to really bolster your damage, especially in the mid game. You're going to be starting to deal chunky amounts of damage as you make 2 attacks, each one having plus 10 damage to the attack. We also get to ignore High Ground, which is quite nice. A little bit niche, it doesn't really help you too much, but it is still very useful. And the main thing, of course, is the power attack that we're going to be taking advantage of. We have the archery fighting style, so this really is just a -3 penalty if you think about it. All right, fighter level 7, we are going to get another arcane shot. And if I had to pick another one that you would be using around level 7, which is about the middle game, I would definitely be going for Beguiling Arrow. Being able to charm targets, especially targets that are on your ass, is very, very valuable. Especially if you're in melee. If you can land a Beguiling Arrow onto your enemy and charm them in melee, you do not have to risk opportunity attacks. Of course, you do have disadvantage on shots in melee, so be aware of that. But regardless, it's still very powerful. Very, very useful. I really like the Beguiling Arrow. All right, and then at level 8, we get another feat. Now, at this point, we have flexibility in the build. You can actually take whatever you want. I would recommend taking an ASI and then just bumping up intelligence, because our DC for the arrows, which I didn't mention, but the DC for our arrows is based off our intelligence modifier. It's not based off of our dex or constitution or anything else. It's based off of our intelligence modifier, which is why we had it at a 16. So if you want, you can bump that up. If you want, you can take Resilient, and then you can get proficiency in a saving throw. Of course, if you are going to take Resilient, I recommend respecking or resetting so that you have an odd score for your intelligence, wisdom, or dexterity, or whatever you're going to take Resilient in. That way, when you take Resilient, it's a half feat. You can even that score and then get a +1 in addition to adding your proficiency for the ability. You can take Tough if you want to get some HP. You can take Alert if you want to go first. But, given that this is a dexterity build, you're usually going to go first already. So that isn't usually a concern. Now, we could also take Lucky if we want to be a little bit more reliable in terms of being able to reroll saves or reroll attacks. Lucky is very, very useful for that. So you have lots and lots of options. I'm going to go with the straightforward, just a bonus to our intelligence. All right, at fighter level 9, we are going to get access to absolutely nothing. We're going to get Indom. Fighter level 10, we get access to another arcane shot. Oh, and I forgot to mention this, but we are getting arcane arrows as we level up. So the investment into arcane archer, it really does reward you for staying with arcane archer. Obviously it's fighter, so we really want to hit 11 for that third attack, but additionally we are getting more arcane shots or arcane arrows that we can use as a resource to fire our arcane shots as we level up. But early on, you're going to feel a little bit constrained with how many times you can use arcane arrow, but towards the mid and late game of BG3, you're going to have just tons of arcane arrows to throw out. So as long as you're getting your short rest in, that's going to reset your counter for your arcane arrows. Like, you are going to have plenty of arcane arrows to throw out in fights. And of course, you have regular magic, the regular arrows that you can use, such as the arrow of humanoid slaying. You can use the arrow shock or arrow of many targets. You're going to be interchanging between your arcane arrows as well as those. So you'll always have options in battle, a shocking amount of options, really. More options than you would have if you were like a regular marshal. All right, and then with our arcane shots that we can get at level 10, what I'm going to recommend, really at this point, you have the flexibility to kind of take one leftover of these shots that isn't necessarily going to be the best most of the time, but can be pretty niche. The grasping arrow, really good if you want to slow down your enemy more, but it is going to be on a strength save, so keep that in mind. And then enfeebling arrow, this is going to make your enemy deal half damage, so it's a great supporting shot type. If you want to hit the boss and enfeeble them, and then your tank in the front lines is going to be taking less damage, that's very valuable as well, but it's on a con save, so just keep those things in mind. And we're going to go with enfeebling shot because there are some enemies that hit very, very hard. Having the enfeebling shot on top of being able to blind them or charm them, it's just going to disable them pretty much entirely. All right, and now we finally get to fighter level 11. This is where you become a god because you get improved extra attacks. You're making 3 attacks every single turn. Now, if you action surge, you're making another 3 attacks for a total of 6 attacks in a single turn. If you've got Terrazul, that's going to haste you for another 3 attacks. If you've got haste, you're going to have another 3 attacks. If you've got Elixir of Bloodlust, that's another 3 attacks. Of course, if you're playing on honor mode, those are going to be less attacks. But still, regardless, you can make a catastrophically high amount of attacks, specifically because of your action surge. That's going to let you really be able to burst down priority targets. You can use if you want, you can use your arrow shots to disable a ton of different enemies, or repeatedly use pure shot to do lots of AoE damage. But for the most part, when you're action surging, you're going to be using that to burst down a target, to maybe first blind them so the rest of your shots are going to have advantage, and then absolutely pelt them with a ton of arrows of slaying or whatever else you have. But yeah, this thing is devastating. Once we hit level 11, we are the king of range damage. And then of course, we're going to get that next level up, and we're going to put that into Cleric. Now, honestly, if you wanted to do a different domain, that's totally up to you. War Domain is going to synergize the most because of a subclass feature called War Priest, which is going to allow us to make an additional attack as a bonus action. But just do keep in mind, it is a little bit finicky with your arcane shots. So if you're going to be using your arcane shots or your arcane arrows as your attacks, it's not going to proc War Priest. It's not going to register that you can make another additional attack as a bonus action if your last shot was an arcane arrow. So keep that in mind. There's a little bit of an anti-synergy there. I don't know if that's a bug or not, but regardless, do keep that in mind. It's going to be, you have to be very strategic about when you want to proc War Priest. But even if you don't use War Priest for your bonus action attacks, you do have the bonus action spells Divine Favor for extra damage. You got Shield of Faith for AC, and of course the most important spell of all is going to be Sanctuary. Sanctuary is god tier in BG3. It entirely prevents you from being targeted or harmed by other creatures until you do damage. So if you cast this at the end of your turn, you're pretty much safe until your next turn. You don't have to worry about getting bursted down in melee. You don't have to worry about enemies hitting you with their highest damage dealing spells. Sanctuary is freaking absolutely goated, and taking this at level 12 really rounds out our character to have the survivability they need to take on those big endgame fights. We are going to show you guys some footage of taking on Orin's fight as well as the Viconia Sanctuary fight. Both of those can be challenging for full parties, but we're just taking it on solo because, you know, why the hell not? That's how good this build is. You are able to use your arcane arrows to disable your opponents. And we're gonna, I mean, we'll get into discussion, especially with the itemization of the build, because that's also what makes this build very strong. But just, yeah, there's so much to this build that makes it a ton of fun to play. And let's just get straight into the itemization so I can talk more about it. All right, so as I said earlier, we just took care of the Orin fight. We were able to solo that pretty easily. And looking at our build, one of the key things that we're going to be talking about today is going to be the Helmet of Arcane Acuity. If you look over here, you can actually see I had stacks of Arcane Acuity from attacking. For those of you guys who are not aware of this item, the Helmet of Arcane Acuity, whenever you deal damage with a weapon attack, which is all of your attacks, you're going to be gaining stacks of Arcane Acuity for 2 turns. And each stack is going to add a +1 bonus to your spell attack and DC for each remaining turn. So basically, you're able to stack this up to a maximum of 10, meaning you get a +10 to attack rolls and spell difficulty class. Now, what is particularly useful about this, I don't know why they always have the tooltip for this bugged where the spell save here, it says 0. But if we actually hover over it, it shows our base DC is 8 plus our proficiency bonus. And then it also seems to be not even adding our intelligence for some odd reason. It's supposed to add our intelligence. So it should be 8 plus our proficiency plus our intelligence mod. And then we're adding on the Arcane Acuity from our helmet. With 7 stacks, we are increasing the DC by 7. Our base DC, if we have a +3, is going to be 8 plus 4 for PB, and then +3, so that'd be 15, which isn't very high. Most enemies would be able to pass that, but because of Arcane Acuity, we have a +7 on top of that. So we're going from a 15 to a 22 DC, which is much, much harder. And oftentimes, especially if it's an enemy's weak saves, they're going to be failing that. So a crucial item to getting all of these arrow shots that I said were very powerful because they apply CC, they blind the target, they charm the target, they are going to banish the target. They are extremely effective at high level because of the Helmet of Arcane Acuity. At low levels, you don't really even have to worry about that too much because you're going to be targeting typically bad saves for creatures anyways. You're not going to find a goblin, well, unless they're a warlock or something like that, that has a very high charisma saving throw, right? You fight a martial character, chances are if you Banishing Arrow, they're going to get banished, and so on and so forth. So this is really for Act 3. You're going to need the Helmet of Arcane Acuity on this character. It is essential. It's weird that, you know, it says Arcane Acuity applies for spell DC, but this works for the arrows. I'm not complaining. I'm glad that works. That's our main piece of gear in terms of giving us functionality for these arrows. However, what is definitely underrated and what I want to very clearly state at the beginning for itemization is that your melee weapons actually do make a big difference for your range damage. Now, that doesn't make any sense, I know, but that's because the buffs, whatever the persistent effects are from your weapons, those actually apply to your ranged weapon as well. Now, what do I mean by that? Our character is able to crit on 18s, 19s, and 20s. Why is that? Because we have Knife of the Undermountain. Knife of the Undermountain, it is going to increase our crit range by 1, and it can stack with other effects similar. So this is very powerful because even though it doesn't say it, this applies to our other offhand weapon as well as our ranged attacks. So whenever we crit, if we roll a 19 instead of a 20, we're going to be critting on that. Now, this is going to stack, and of course, we're going to be using Deadshot as our main bow. This weapon has improved criticals, so it has an increased crit range by 1. So this weapon by itself, we'd be critting on 19s and 20s, and then with Knife of the Undermountain, we're critting on 18, 19s, and 20s, or vice versa. Additionally, it has keen attacks, so the wielder doubles their PB when rolling range attacks unless they have disadvantage. But even though it's only a +2 weapon, it's adding another +4 to my attack rolls because my PB, actually, where do we see PB? Here it is. Our PB is +4. So this weapon by itself is giving us a +6 to hit, in addition to everything else we have. So it's pretty much negating the power shot from the sharpshooter, taking a -5 to our attack rolls entirely. We are able to have very high accuracy to hit the targets we need to hit. And also we have an increased crit range. So if we crit, we just fucking hit them. Doesn't matter, right? Now, additionally, in our offhand, we have the weapon Dolor Amaris. This is going to add 7 damage whenever we crit. This is basically a vicious weapon dagger. Now, this applies to our range damage, and because we have an increased crit range, we're going to be critting quite often, and every single time we crit, we're adding on 7 damage. That is the equivalent to 2 extra d6 worth of damage die. That's very powerful, and that's pretty much the main reason why we are sticking with these 2 items. Knife of the Undermountain, Dolor Amaris. Get those as quick as you can. I mean, you can get this in Act 2, then Dolor Amaris, you can get pretty early into Act 3. And these items, if you're not using them for your other characters, is going to be incredibly, it's just so fucking good on our Arcane Archer. Because the Deadshot is also a weapon that we can get very early into Act 3. Well, I say very early, but you have to at least get the Baldur's Gate into the city. Now, with these 3 weapons, our base damage output is solid. Very, very solid. Whenever we hit, we have a good chance to crit, and when we crit, we're dealing an additional 7 points of damage, in addition to the fact that we have +10 damage from sharpshooter. However, because we're critting a lot, we want to get more damage dice. But where that's going to come handy is our glove choice. We're going to be using the Helldust gloves. Now, these are going to give us a bonus to spell attack rolls and spell save DC. This actually does apply to our arcane arrows, so that's quite nice. But additionally, we deal an additional 1d6 fire damage on attacks. So whenever we crit, we're going to be dealing 2d6 fire damage instead of 1d6. And that is very, very nice. For our chest piece, we are going to be using the Armor of Agility. This lets you add your full dexterity mod to your armor class. And it is a pretty much a +1 piece of half plate, I believe. Maybe +2. It's 17 AC base, which is very high, because when we add on our agility, which is a +5, we're going to be already getting 22 AC, and then of course we can stack on whatever else we would like on top of that. So you can see at the moment we would be having, oh, I actually respec this character wrong, and I had the defense fighting style instead of the archery fighting style. So this would be a +13 because I should be having the archery fighting style, and my AC should be a 25 instead. But as you can see, the Armor of Agility is going to be a very solid armor for giving us good AC so that we don't take too many hits. We are a ranged character, so we're not super tanky. We're a fighter mostly, though, so we honestly can take a beating. For our boots, we have the Helldust boots. This is going to give us Infernal Evasion, basically the ability to have a legendary resistance to auto pass those really bad effects. And, you know, in terms of our cape option, the Cloak of Protection is always going to be solid. It's going to increase our AC and our saves. But of course, if we want damage, what we can go with is the Mantle of the Holy Warrior. So this is going to give us the ability to cast Crusader's Mantle. It's a good support item too, because we're going to be able to at least once per day apply an AoE buff that is going to be adding +1d4 radiant damage to everyone's attacks, including our own. That's a nice boost. We do have Divine Favor in the event that we want to just be selfish and buff ourselves rather than our party. But regardless, that's going to be a good cape option. There's also Cloak of Displacement, Deathstalker's Mantle, whatever else you want. And then for our amulet slot, I have the Face Semblance Amulet because the Orin fight, you really want to pass the Intelligence and Wisdom saves. It's really freaking important. But what is a really good one for damage is going to be the Surgeon Subjugation Amulet. So this one allows you to have a paralyzing critical once per long rest. When you score a crit, you can paralyze the target. It has to be humanoid, just to be clear. It has to be humanoid, but there's a lot of humanoids in Act 3. You paralyze them for 2 turns. And paralyzation, if you guys don't know, it makes it so that attacks within 5 feet of the enemy auto crit. So with our range build, we can just get close enough to be able to make range attacks where we don't have disadvantage in the attacks, but we do still crit. Actually, we might have disadvantage in the attacks, but our attack bonus is so high it doesn't even matter. And if we hit the enemy, we automatically crit. So you can deal tons and tons of damage with the Surgeon Subjugation Amulet. Now we do have an increased crit range, so this item honestly isn't that much value. Once you've used it, you can just swap to another amulet. Not a big deal. For our rings, we have the Ring of Protection. That's just a defensive option. If you want an offensive option, the Caustic Ban is going to be your go-to. But since we have a crit build, what's actually also very powerful is going to be... where is it? Where the frick is it? The Strange Conduit Ring. I saw it for a sec. Yep. The Strange Conduit Ring is going to give us an additional 1d4 psychic damage while we're concentrating on a spell. And guess what? We can concentrate on Crusader's Mantle if we don't have the Cleric level yet. And if we do have the Cleric level, we can concentrate on Divine Favor. And so that way we have something to consistently concentrate on. We could use just Magic Weapon or something similar as well. And we're going to be able to get that bonus 1d4 damage, which is doubling every single time we crit. And what's even crazier is that if you have the Arrow of Humanoid Slaying, you deal straight up double damage, including all your add-ons for on-hit effects. You get to deal insane freaking damage. 42 to 66 damage, that's not including if you get a crit. If you get a critical hit with an Arrow of Humanoid Slaying, you are going to be bursting down your enemies. And of course, there's the other types of Arrows of Slaying. There's the Arrow of Dragon Slaying or Aberration Slaying. Whatever you need, you can stock up on if you want. We also have the Arrow of Many Targets, which is going to be really good for proccing our Helmet of Arcane Acuity. You're going to hit multiple enemies, and for every enemy you hit, it's going to count towards the Helmet of Arcane Acuity. We can get pretty much like 8 to 10 stacks within the first or the second attack that we make at the start of combat. And that's going to make it so that the subsequent arcane shots we make are going to always work. Our enemies are just going to auto-fail them because it's like a DC 25. There's a very low chance your enemies are going to pass that, at least on a consistent basis. So overall, this build, it works around being able to deal a ton of damage at long range. But we also have the versatility that if there is a lot of enemies in the battlefield, we can remove the priority ones that we don't want to worry about with Banishing Arrow. We can deal with small groups of enemies with Piercing Arrow. We can deal with spellcasters by blinding them, or even melee characters by blinding them and charming them. And then, of course, I have the Grasping Arrow on this character, but I would say the fifth one, like these 4 are essential. Banishing, Piercing, Shadow, and Beguiling. Want to definitely have those 4 by the time you're level 12. The fifth one, totally up to you, whatever you prefer. You could take Feeble, you could take Grasping. It really doesn't make that much of a difference because you're getting most of your value out of these 4. But hey, if I'm missing anything or if you guys have found better uses for the other arrows, do let me know in the comments. This is pretty much going to be it for the itemization part of the build. That already took way too long for me to explain, so we're just going to go over some actual gameplay. Alright, so we're going into the Viconia Shar Sanctum fight. Our character is buffed up with the Elixir Bloodlust and Warding Bond, but really we didn't even need the Warding Bond. The Elixir Bloodlust kind of carries us most of the way. We are going to start by using the Arrow of Many Targets on our enemies. That is going to be chunking out these large groups. Oh, we also have Oil of Combustion on our arrows. That's how we're dealing extra fire damage. That's a really, really powerful item to have. I did not go over to the itemization, but if you need a big boost to damage, Oil of Combustion is the way to go, especially for groups of enemies. As you can see, we are now banishing the mages that are going to cast darkness on us. Because of Arcane Acuity, Even if those guys have high charisma saves, we have a extremely high spell save DC, so we're able to banish out two of the spellcasters. Then we're going to be using our grasping arrow on that knight over there to slow him down, casting Sanctuary on ourselves, and we're going to kite back. And because of Sanctuary, we are not going to get attacked at all this turn, and all of the enemies are going to have to slowly stack in on us. Now, normally when you're playing an archer-like character, your weakness is groups of enemies, but because of the build we have with the piercing arrow, and in this case we do have oil of combustion, which helps out a lot for AoE, we're able to deal with groups of enemies in the case that we do get surrounded. Actually, what am I saying? There's even the arrow of many targets, so normally a ranged character back in the day, before patch 8, you know, like a Gloomstalker Ranger was still going to be able to deal with a group of enemies, a large group of enemies. You know, Battlemaster Fighter would still be able to deal with a large group of enemies, but with the addition of the Arcane Archer, we're even better at dealing with large groups of enemies, especially because of the piercing arrow. That is a massive AoE. If you can get enemies lined up for that, I mean, usually you'll be able to hit at least 3 enemies with it if you're surrounded, but if you can hit, you know, 4, 5, 6 enemies, that is going to be outputting massive damage, even over your other sorts of arrows, like the arrow of many targets or the explosive arrow. You're going to see here, because of Sanctuary, these enemies don't really have anything to do other than just dash and run at us. So that's exactly what's happening here. We're going to get surrounded, but that is going to be to our benefit because it's grouping the enemies nice and close so that we can hit them with our abilities. The first thing I look at is whether or not we should do a piercing shot to break concentration on the spellcaster here. We go for it and immediately break concentration while also dealing a nice chunk of AoE to everyone. And then I debate whether or not we use an explosive arrow here to break them apart. But what's going to be better is an arrow of many targets, and boom, a freaking quad crit. Because we crit on 18s, 19s, it is very easy for us to roll crits on the arrow of many targets, and that does a lot of damage. I mean, think about that, hitting 4 targets, each one critting, dealing at least 40 to 60 points of damage. Then we go in for a piercing arrow here. Boom. We have already chipped down Viconia to 50 HP, and then we just kill her outright with an arrow of humanoid slaying. It's that easy. And of course, given that we're fighter, we can also action surge and then make a just series of regular attacks at our surrounding enemies and chunk them all out. Now, oil of combustion is doing a lot of work, admittedly. You know, you're only going to have so many oil of combustions, even if you're using the exploits to reset vendors and get more of the consumables there. But I would say that this is a pretty worthwhile fight to use it if you are soloing for some psychopathic reason. If you're not, then you don't even need to burn the resources on this. You can just play your Arcane Archer as normal, and you're probably going to have a much easier time conserving your arrows of many targets, your arrows of slaying, and things like that. But when it comes to the big fights, you know, why not use them for Act 3 if you saved up all these resources? We definitely go a little bit ham with our arrows of many targets, and well, actually, we don't even burn through that many arrows of slaying in this. But again, it's just showcasing how powerful the Arcane Archer is, that by ourselves, I mean, we're able to deal with this entire mass of enemies with relative ease. So going back over to our turn, we're in the darkness, but it's not very prohibitive because we can simply just move up. And again, with our Knife of the Undermountain and our Deadshot, we have increased crit, our armor, our items. They are all just synergizing together very nicely. We just move up and out of the blinded, then we just blast away. Just to be a bit extra cheeky, we used a special shot there, and as you can tell, it did a lot of damage. If we crit using our Beguiling Arrow or our Shadow Arrow, that's another 2d6 psychic damage that gets doubled to 46. We're able to stack quite a bit of damage dice on top of our arrows, and that makes the crit build that much more effective and that much more deadly. I think there already are probably a few Arcane Archer guides, but I'm not sure if any of them itemize in the way that we have, where we are really specifically taking advantage of critical hits, where while also still making sure our character has good AC. They have survivability in the build with the Cleric level, with any sort of itemization you want to take. If you want to take the Face Semblance Amulet for advantage on all saving throws, you have the flexibility to do that. Archers don't really have any staple bested slot amulets. So if you want to take the, subjugation amulet so that you can paralyze foes, that makes sense. But also having advantage on all mental saves at all times is very, very powerful as well. So a lot of the times I go with Face Semblance, but if I need healing, then I'll go with the Periapple Wound Closure, because that'll maximize any healing you get from potions. So you have tons of options in terms of like the necklaces and the rings for the build. The main thing is the Helmet of Acuity, Arcane Acuity. That's like a must-have on this character. Really, really, really high value on this character, because it lets all of their arcane shots work almost never fail. I've never had my arcane shots fail at high level if I had 10 stacks of Arcane Acuity. Putting down a Sanctuary here just to be cheeky, and pretty much all these enemies, they have nothing to do other than really cast just darkness. But unfortunately, darkness will not help them here, because our character has a very high to hit and doesn't really care. And also, we can just walk out of the darkness and blast them. That'll be the final shot. That's it. It's that easy. Build is not terribly complicated to play, but because you have so many options with your shots, there is going to be a huge variety to your playstyle that you can do, and that makes this build so much fun. Alright, so we're also going to show you guys the Orin fight. This is a pretty big spoiler, but, I mean, Baldur's Gate 3 has been out for so long. If this is a spoiler for you, that's just unfortunate. Skip this part of the video. This is a big fight, a big boss fight in Act 3, and it can be quite a difficult one, especially for people who are less experienced with Baldur's Gate 3. So if you're able to use the Arcane Archer, you're definitely going to have a much easier time, because you're going to have access to the Arrows of Roaring Thunder, which I didn't show, but I basically use 6 Arrows of Roaring Thunder to knock off all the people in the ritual here, because they have Sanctuary and they're very difficult to deal with otherwise. But we cheese the fuck out of all of them. And then, of course, we are now dealing with the Slayer form of Orin. The first thing we have to worry about is her stacks of Unstoppable, which are really nasty. That's where playing a fighter comes in really handy, because we have tons of attacks per turn. So even if we're by ourselves, we are actually chipping away at her stacks of Unstoppable very easily. And I accidentally kill Lizelle with an arrow of many targets. I didn't realize that was going to jump to her. So that was unfortunate, or actually that might have been Oil of Combustion, I'm not sure, but either way, we kill Lizelle, which is unfortunate, but it also procs our Elixir of Bloodlust, so no complaints there. We are able to pelt Orin with a ton more shots, and what's actually very powerful is that we have access to both the Shadow and the Beguiling Shot. Her Wisdom saves actually are pretty decent, so we succeed in blinding her. We also succeed in charming her, but for some reason that just disappears. She might be immune to charm. So we're just going to end up casting... Actually, no, we're not going to cast Sanctuary this turn. We're going to cast Sanctuary the following turn. We're just going to end up ending turn and hoping for the best. She is blinded. So instead, she goes for this jump and the Piercing Gaze attack, which we end up passing the save on that. So we're totally fine. Basically nothing happened. And then when it jumps on over back to our turn, we're going to use an Arrow of Many Targets to kill that little skeleton dude. We're going to get our extra action from the Elixir of Bloodlust, and now we can really go to town on Orin. So this would be like if we saved our action surge. And you can tell that with our increased crit range, we are critting very frequently, especially if we have advantage on attack rolls because the enemy's blinded. We're going to be critting on 18s or higher. And if we have advantage in the attack roll, our crit chance is looking, well into the 20s, maybe even 25%. Not too sure on the exact math for that. I could get that done, but I haven't done it at the moment. It is very high. That's all you need to know. You're going to feel great about it because you're going to just constantly see these massive numbers from critting. The enemy is going to jump in on us, but guess what? They can't do anything because we have Sanctuary, and that one level of Cleric, that small dip into Cleric, is what makes our character, at least in the endgame of Act 3, very difficult to deal with. If we cast Sanctuary on ourselves, pretty much most enemies won't be able to do anything. The worst you have to worry about is AoE effects and darkness. Darkness is really bad, especially if we get stuck in it for whatever reason. But again, most of the time when we cast Sanctuary, we just get ourselves a breathing room for an entire round, which is very, very powerful. It's better than the shield spell in some cases because we can still get crit if we have the shield spell. Just keep in mind that you have to use Sanctuary at the end of your turn. So that's going to be it for the build. Overall, this was a very long video, a lot longer than I intended, but it was just so much fun playing the Arcane Archer and actually looking into all the shot types. So I hope you guys try out this build for yourselves. I promise you, you're going to have a ton of fun with it. This has the most options out of any range build that I've ever played. So try it out. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you made it this far, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I will see you guys in the next one.